Thank you for being here. May suggested that I introduce myself since I don't know most of you. My name is Peter Staudenmaier. I have worked with the Institute for Social Ecology since the late 1980s, initially through political organizing. I was involved in the Left Green Network and the Youth Greens with a couple of people who are going to be with us, who are already going to be with us this week, back in the day. And then also directly at the ISE, starting in, I don't remember, 1991, maybe? Something like that. And I've been on the faculty for a long time at the Institute. It's a very important part of my political identity and my personal identity. In my professional life, I am a historian. So if I mention history a lot in this talk, you will know why. I teach at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That's where I grew up, and that's where I live now. Many years ago, starting in 1999, I think, I helped create an entire month-long course called Understanding Capitalism with my friend and comrade Dorini Nicholas at the ISE. So we used to have, she and I used to do this much more intensive version, which then is, in the years since then, has sort of shrunk down to this 2-hour session. And as usual, we're going to set aside the second hour of this for small group discussions. So I'm only going to take an hour of your time. And I'm also going to make it very participatory. I try to make these things as lively as I possibly can. I'm going to involve you all in some questions and discussion and so on and so forth. But I mentioned that. I mentioned the longer version of this course that Dorini and I taught together for years on end, just to let you know that I could talk about this stuff for weeks on end if you let me. So if folks are interested in talking about any of the issues that come up today in more depth, I will be here all week. So please don't be shy. Please come and find me at meals and at the quarry and things like that. I am more than happy to have debates and have discussions and continue the dialogue. A lot of what I say for this afternoon is going to build on several things that Mason and Brian said yesterday. They both brought up really important aspects of a social ecology perspective on capitalism, and I'm going to take off from the foundation that they already set. And I'll tell you right now the conclusion. I won't leave you in suspense. From a social ecologist's point of view, capitalism is an irrational system. It doesn't make any sense. And social ecologists believe that capitalism cannot be made rational. We don't think that's possible. We look at capitalism as flatly incompatible with human needs, and we think capitalism as fundamentally irreconcilable with the basic ecological parameters of the planet that we live on, the only planet that we have, as far as we know. And we think that part is important. We're not reformists when it comes to capitalism. We are radicals when it comes to capitalism. We are abolitionists when it comes to capitalism. We are revolutionaries when it comes to capitalism, and we always have been. In about a minute, I'll say a little bit more about that always have been part, because I think it's important. For social ecologists, the problem with capitalism is not just its particular manifestations. It's not just things like industrial factories and polluting technologies and multinational corporations and billionaires who want to send themselves to the moon and stuff like that. For social ecologists, the problem with capitalism lies at a deeper level. The problem is the fundamental structures of capitalism as a system. And that's what I'm going to try to get us to think about today. I want to get us thinking about what are the fundamental features of capitalism as a system. See if we can sort of dig that out. My hunch is we're not all going to agree on those fundamental features, and that is great. This is not the kind of question where everybody has to agree. In fact, we probably shouldn't. This is the kind of question where we can have very healthy, critical, comradely debates. So one of the several things that you might find yourself doing in our small group discussions later on is arguing about some of those details. And some of them aren't really details. Some of them are actually really important, substantive questions. I'm going to lay out my point of view on those questions. You will figure out where I'm coming from really quickly. but there are lots of other possible radical anti-capitalist perspectives to be found around the Institute for Social Ecology. Okay, so I said a second ago, it actually matters that social ecologists have been anti-capitalists from the beginning. Mason mentioned yesterday, and Brian mentioned yesterday, the Institute for Social Ecology has existed for half a century now. It was founded in 1974. We're about to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And a critique of capitalism, a principled critique of capitalism, has been a core part of social ecology's broader critique of all the various forms of hierarchy and domination from the very beginning. Now, if you look at that from a 2024 perspective, it doesn't actually seem all that remarkable. Because from today's point of view, from the climate movement's perspective, the connection between the contemporary climate crisis and capitalism seems overwhelmingly obvious. The reason I mention this is that it was not at all obvious for much of that 50-year period that the ISE has been around. You don't even have to go back to 1974 to get to a time when a whole lot of the environmental movement, not just in the United States, by the way, when a whole lot of the environmental movement did not have a critique of capitalism. In fact, a whole lot of the environmental movement rejected a critique of capitalism. A couple of people here can tell you, I mentioned that I worked with the Left Green Network and the Youth Greens in the late 80s and the early 90s. A couple of people, ask anybody who worked in those groups back in the day what it was like when we put forward a principled and explicit anti-capitalist stance. We got a whole lot of pushback, and that was true well into the 1990s. As weird as that may sound for some of you who think of the 1990s, the later 1990s is the period when anti-capitalism eventually took over the movement. That's true, but that was well into the 1990s before that happened. Social ecologists were anti-capitalists from the start, and we wouldn't shut up about it. We really wouldn't. We kept putting that line forward in various different contexts. And if I may say so, if I may put it bluntly, we took a lot of shit for it at the time. That's what it means to take a principled stance on a question. You don't just say it when it's popular. You don't just say it when you think people are going to say, hey, let me join your club. That sounds awesome. You say it because you think it's true, whether or not there's a majority ready to, rally around your flag. That's why I think that's important to mention as a bit of historical background to what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay. For those of us who grew up in a capitalist society, and I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that that's most of us here, even though I'm going to be talking about capitalism primarily as an economic system, I do want to note capitalism is actually more than just an economic system. It's an entire form of society. It's almost like it's an entire way of life. And for those of us, like myself, who grew up in a capitalist society, that paradoxically can make it harder rather than easier for many of us to even figure out what are some of the core features of capitalism, simply because we so often take them for granted. We so often just assume, yeah, that's just how the economy works. It always has worked that way. It's just the way I grew up with. It's the way my mom and dad grew up with. It's the way my grandma and grandpas grew up with. It's just the way economics is. It totally makes sense when we think that, but it's also totally false. What's true about that is, okay, maybe that's the way economics works in a capitalist society, but remember how I said I was a historian a few minutes ago? If you look back at it historically, and you trace back the emergence of capitalism, historians debate everything. Historians are still debating exactly when and where capitalism emerged, but it's just not all that old. They basically think it's a few centuries old. Okay, a few centuries, that's kind of old. No human individual lives that long, but think about it for a second. Human societies have been around for thousands of years. Do the math for a second. That means the vast majority of human societies that ever existed were not capitalist. I am not saying, to avoid any possible misunderstanding, I am not saying that those human societies were somehow magically free and beautiful and wonderful places to live. Feudalism sucked. dude, if you weren't the prince or the duke or something, these other societies were not necessarily free and awesome. Some of them were pretty amazing. Some of the indigenous societies, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them were awful and hierarchical and oppressive and exploitative in their own way. What they weren't was capitalist. Capitalism is relatively new in historical terms, and it's really unusual. Part of what I'm going to try to get us to understand today is a few of the ways that capitalism is actually weird and strange, historically speaking. Okay. To start that out, I want to do my first set of sort of question and answer. And before I even pose my first question for you, I want to note explicitly, I am not asking this first question in any way to get anybody here to second guess their personal consumption choices. That's exactly the opposite of where I'm going with this particular question. You'll see why in a minute, but I want to say that before I even pose the question. Okay, normally when I pose, it's a really simple question. Normally when I pose this question, the question I ask is about something that you may or may not have drunk this morning. But it's weird to ask that question because most of us are camping here. So if you had that particular beverage this morning, you probably had it down. You all had the exact same thing down in the tent. So I'm going to instead ask you to think back to yesterday. Think back to Friday, the day we arrived here. Who had coffee yesterday morning? Raise your hands. Dozens and dozens and dozens of hands go up around the room. Okay, if you had coffee yesterday morning, did you make it yourself? Maybe you were at home before you hopped in the car. Okay, a couple people, part of the Seattle faction. Okay, if you made it yourself, do you know where the beans came from? 1, 2, hey, wow. This is more hands than I've ever gotten when I've done this. You know where the beans came, kind of sort of know where the beans, that's cool, that's good enough. If you know where the beans came from, do you know a little bit about the people who grew them, the conditions they work under? Ooh, we got an A+ winner over here. Tell me more.
So,
are you part of a fair trade network? Cooperative?
Zapatistas.
Fucking A, dude. Sorry, can I say that? Say more.
So the School of Chiapas program, which is the education.
He buys them from the Zapatistas in Chiapas for the folks online.
So there's a website called School of Chiapas. The
What's cool? The website is called School of Chiapas.
Of course, I'll share it later.
We're going to send it around.
I'll send it around. So they sell to a roastery here in the United States.
Okay.
It's a nonprofit.
Right.
Through beans that they are grown in Chiapas themselves by the farming co-ops. You can actually also buy their corn seeds too, which is really cool.
And cool.
You can buy it for a minimum price. It's at like a 1 to 5 pound bag, and then there's some stuff on delivery fees. There is a minimum requirement, but you can also pay more.
Sure.
So
as a solidarity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Essentially, you can also buy boots from Chiapas too, which is interesting.
Am I allowed to say your name?
Sure.
Talk to Dominic. That was so awesome. Can anyone more or less match that level of knowledge for those of you who made your coffee at home?
No, I'm with him.
What you got? That's okay. Yes.
Mine's from Guatemala, and it was probably made with some form of slave labor.
Okay. So knowledge, but not as encouraging
No.
knowledge. Excellent.
Deep, violent civil war that's basically still ongoing.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's bad, but
Her-
that's where almost all coffee comes from.
Exactly. Her answer was she's pretty sure that her beans came from Guatemala, but was probably made with some form of slave labor, which is for conventionally grown and for what it's worth, some sustainably grown forms of coffee beans. That's probably the norm for a lot of coffee buyers up here in the north. What I want to note, thank you so much to everybody who's willing to answer that question. What I just want to note is that the vast majority of the hands that went up just don't have the information that I was kind of interested in asking. And I didn't even get to stuff like, do we know much about the growing conditions, sustainable, conventional, et cetera, et cetera. What I was really kind of more interested in was, do we know much about the conditions that the workers work under. And then I had a whole second set of questions about, do we know much about how the beans got from where they're grown up to wherever y'all started from yesterday? I'm guessing somewhere in the Pacific Northwest if you drove rather than flew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all really worthwhile questions that, for the most part, are just generally hard for most of us to answer. Okay, follow-up question for some of the others here. How about those of you who didn't make your own coffee yesterday morning but went and bought a cup of coffee? Anybody in that group? For those of you in that group, do you know anything about the people who made that cup of coffee? Do you know much about their working conditions, what their workplace is like? Do you know if they have much say in shaping their place of work? Do you know much about that? What you know?
I'm 99% sure they don't have any.
You're 99% sure they have no say in shaping their place of work. Yeah. I take it was maybe a corporate chain of some sort?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
Private owned, and they are just hourly workers.
Exactly. Privately owned, they're an hourly worker. Okay. It's probably a safe bet. They have almost no say in shaping their place of work. Anybody in a different JC?
Yeah, I was in the other group, but just as a note, because I buy a lot of Starbucks or whatever, what I find interesting is that I think that most people, or a lot of people in this place, might know about the conditions of the baristas, because many of them might have done part-time barista work at some point or another, but
Beat me to
they
it.
don't know the conditions about the people who grew the beans. And I think that that's an interesting twist from, for example, our parents' generation, if we come from middle-class backgrounds, where they would have known about neither. Now, some people raised middle class know about at least the service sector at the end, at the retail end, and that's kind of interesting.
That is totally true. JMC just made a really important comment. It's about 4 lines later here. No, you.
Sorry.
No, right on. You are so right that a lot of folks here, without making any assumptions about anybody else's background here, I worked a lot of retail. I worked a lot. I waited tables. I did a lot of that stuff in my younger years, and it gives you that perspective of what it's like to be the person doing the serving at the tail end of the process. And I still had no freaking clue about anything that happened prior to any of the production processes that happened prior to that point where I happened to work in a really ritzy, fancy club up in northern Michigan where the top executives from the auto companies came in the summer in the late 1980s. So I served some really wealthy people. I just had no idea where the stuff that I was serving them came from before it got into my hands and then into their mouths. So that is a really important point. Some of us do actually have some sense of what it's like to be the barista, to be the person who's preparing that cup, depending on where we may or may not have worked or where our friends work or something. And just to point out, maybe some of us went to the local food co-op to buy that cup of coffee. That's entirely possible. And then maybe you actually know more about the conditions of work, and maybe those conditions are better. Not perfect, God knows. For those of us who worked in food co-ops, it's not an ideal work situation, but it's going to be different from. So you might have some information. So here's what I'm getting at. And again, just to make really clear, the point of this is in no way to make anyone feel bad about their personal consumption choices. Because did I ask anything about the consumption process? Did I ask you how your coffee tasted? Did I even ask you how much it cost? I didn't get into that. The stuff I am trying to ask us to think about has much more to do with production. I'm interested in where did this stuff come from? How is it made? Who is making it? How does it get from one place to another? And what I'm trying to get us to think about is, why do we typically know, with this really important exception, the Zapatista Cooperative, et cetera, which I totally want to learn more about from Dominic, with this really important exception, which is important, these alternative possibilities exist now under capitalism and could be built on and could be enlarged. They could take space away from the existing capitalist economy, but those are exceptions. The norm under capitalism is that most of us, most of the time, effectively know next to nothing about even the most simple items that we use every day. And note, I only asked about the coffee. What if you put sugar in your coffee? Where was that grown? Under what conditions? Who did the labor? How did it get from there to here? And so on and so forth. The questions get really, really complicated really, really fast. So what I'm trying to see here, what I'm trying to get us to see here, capitalism has one of these built-in dynamics. I'm going to say that phrase several times this afternoon, a built-in dynamic, a built-in feature of capitalism. It has a built-in dynamic that it separates us from each other. Most of us work. Most of us spend a chunk of our time working, and most of us depend on the work of other people just to get through our daily lives. Not even to do anything special, but just to make it through the day. We work, we depend on the work of others. And there is something about the way capitalism is structured that makes it virtually impossible to see what we have in common, to see what links us, to see the connections that we actually have. It takes a lot of work to get something like coffee, to get something like sugar from the places on this planet where it does actually grow to places like the Pacific Northwest where it doesn't actually grow, to get it processed, to get it turned into drinkable and edible, et cetera, form. That's a lot of labor, and it's a lot of land. These things grow in the ground. It takes land and labor for all of that to happen. These are built-in aspects of capitalism as a system that it makes it extra hard to be able to see through and say, other workers in other places are doing their work. I'm doing my work. I know there's a connection there, but I don't have a clue about how to understand what kind of relationship those things might have to one another. Okay, I'm going to introduce my my very first fancy word here. It's so fancy, I'm going to write it on the board. There's a word for things like coffee and sugar and this microphone and the pen that I'm holding in my hand. The word is commodities. All these things are commodities. There's really nothing that special about commodities, except under capitalism. Under capitalism, commodities are extremely special. Don't go away, commodity pen. Under capitalism, commodities are simply things, basically, commodities are virtually anything. Under capitalism, almost anything can be turned into a commodity, with exceedingly few exceptions. They don't even have to be physical objects. Services can and are commodities. When I worked as a waiter all those years ago, my labor was a commodity. Actually, everybody's labor power is a commodity. That's a different story. But just the work that I did, walking across that floor, dressed up in my silly uniform and putting things down in the right way, that's not a physical object. That was just something I was doing with my, with my body. It was a commodity. All sorts of things can be commodities under capitalism. What makes something a commodity is not about any inherent feature of the thing itself. There's nothing special about coffee beans. There's nothing special about sugar cane. There's nothing special about whatever various kinds of plastic this pen is made of. There's nothing about those objects that says they must be commodities. What makes something a commodity is simply its status as an object of exchange. Something that can be bought and sold. That's what it means to be a commodity. In fact, according to one definition of capitalism, capitalism is a system of commodity production, a system where things are produced in order to be exchanged, in order to be bought and sold. So there's nothing specific to the items themselves. Think of the delicious lunch that we just had. Whatever items you had for lunch, depending on your dietary parameters, those things are all commodities. We didn't just go, grow them. As far as I know, is Ben here? Is he down in the kitchen right now? I'd have to check in with him.
The lettuce and greens were grown.
The greens were grown. Thank you, Katie.
In this room.
Beautiful. Okay. So
But
everything else was bought as a commodity. Thank you. Much of what we just put into our own bodies were commodities, but not because it's not the commodity's fault, not because of some specific trait inherent to the items themselves. There is absolutely nothing about those phenomena that says they must be commodities. It is entirely possible to create a different economic system where those things are produced and distributed and used and consumed because they're nutritious, because they're healthful, because they're yummy, because they feed people, because whatever other reason, but not in order so they can be bought and sold. And if we did that, they would no longer be commodities. That would be good news for us and bad news for capitalism. You can't have capitalism if you don't have commodities. That's part of my argument here. You must have commodities in order to have capitalism. But guess what? It's not enough to just have commodities. I just said commodities exist they exist because they are objects of exchange. In order to have capitalism, you also need a mechanism through which those things can be exchanged. Under capitalism, that mechanism is the market, our second fancy term. There's my pen. I think this one's really interesting. This is one of the weirder aspects of capitalism. Markets have existed for a really, 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 really long time. Markets are way, way, way older than capitalism. There is nothing specifically capitalist about markets as such. Does anybody by any chance know a little bit about that history? Does anybody know a little bit about what markets looked like in non-capitalist and pre-capitalist societies? Jonathan, what do you know?
I know it used to be a marketplace.
A marketplace.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, they have a bazaar in the middle of town where people would come together to exchange their products. Yeah.
Beautiful. So a marketplace. Jonathan's in the front, so I'm going to repeat it. A marketplace in pre-capitalist societies was very often an actual place, a physical location. Sometimes it was in the center of town. Sometimes it was, interestingly, sometimes it was decentered somewhat. It was off a little bit more towards the margins of whatever the main habitation was. The point was more that it had some sort of specific geographic boundaries. There was a place that you were expected to go if you were going to engage in market exchange. You weren't supposed to be buying and trading and selling stuff in the rest of your community. The rest of your community was not for that kind of behavior. And that was totally cool because in non-capitalist economies, most of economic life does not depend on buying and selling stuff. Again, to be really, really clear here, that doesn't mean your non-capitalist economy is a wonderful egalitarian utopia. It doesn't say anything else about your non-capitalist economy. It doesn't say if it's free or if it's authoritarian or if it's scary or wonderful. All it says is markets aren't all that important in these other economies. They're there, they exist, but they have specific functions that are generally smaller scale, geographically bounded. Another example is sometimes they have specific chronological boundaries. There were specific times of day when you could engage in market exchange, sometimes specific days of the week, sometimes specific seasons of the year. The idea was, yeah, it's okay to engage in buying and selling, but you're supposed to do it in these particular ways. Most of the rest of economic life didn't revolve around markets and certainly didn't revolve around commodities. In non-capitalist economies, those things exist, but they're not central. Look at our economy today. Under capitalism, the market is not only absolutely central. Can you imagine an important economic activity that somehow happens magically outside of market exchange? It's not only central, it is everywhere all the time. It is 24/7. 365, 366, 367 days a year. There's not many days in a year, but you see what I mean. The market is a constant, never-ending presence in our lives. That's weird. That is genuinely strange from an anthropological perspective, from a historical perspective. No other human societies have ever operated like that. Okay, I know I'm going through this stuff kind of quick. Is that okay? It's okay if I push on for now. All right, so in an ideal capitalist world, if you talk to proponents of capitalism, if you talk to people who are champions of capitalism, which I actually, believe it or not, I'm totally serious, I actually recommend that. I recommend sitting down sometime and talking with a genuine enthusiast to hear their point of view. You probably won't agree with it, but it's kind of helpful just to see how do they conceptualize all this stuff. If you talk with some of those folks, what you'll often hear is that markets should have absolutely no boundaries at all. They think markets work best when they are totally unfettered, when there are no limits of any kind. They think that that's a market utopia in the view of proponents and admirers of capitalism. They also often think that they believe that markets are models of efficiency. This is something that Brian brought up in yesterday's session. In the real world, as all of you are surely aware, markets are frighteningly inefficient. Markets in reality are astonishingly wasteful. So much so that mainstream economists spend a lot of their time trying to solve the problem of market inefficiency. It's anything but an efficient system, despite the claims of people who want to celebrate capitalism. I think that matters. But the real problem, from a social ecologist perspective, isn't really at that level. That's a little too superficial. From a social ecologist perspective, the problem is much deeper. Social ecologists would argue the genuine problem with markets is that they have an inherently expansive dynamic. They have a built-in dynamic, there's that word again, a built-in feature that makes markets try to keep growing ever larger and keep expanding to more and more spheres of social life and keep trying to expand to ever larger parts of the natural world. If the idea behind commodification is to eventually commodify everything, that means markets have to take over more and more forms of human labor and more forms of the land, more and more parts of the planet. And if markets are already unfettered and unbounded under capitalism, there's no way to stop that. There's no way within the logic of capitalism to ever put a brake onto that process. That's the heart of the problem. A society whose fundamental economic logic is built around commodities and markets is going to be a society where democratic principles and egalitarian principles and ecological principles are going to be pushed to the margins. It's going to be a society where instead things like accumulation for private gain is going to be more and more the centerpiece of economic life, and where economic life in turn is going to be the centerpiece of social life as a whole. That is not the kind of society that can ever be made ecologically sustainable, and it's not the kind of society that can be made responsive to human needs. Okay. What that means from a climate movement perspective is that the catastrophe we are all currently facing, the climate crisis seems too mild a word for me, the climate catastrophe that we are all currently facing, it's not a natural disaster, it's not some sort of accident. It is, as both Mason and Brian put it yesterday, it is the result of a specific set of social institutions, not just capitalism, but capitalism is fully integrated, fully bound up with that set of social institutions. That is both good news and bad news. And I think it's important to understand why. It's good news because, as I keep saying, capitalism has a history. Capitalism is a human-created social institution. Here's why that's good news. Human beings don't get to just overturn the second law of thermodynamics. We don't have the power to do that. That's beyond the realm of human capacity to change. Capitalism's not like that. It's not a law of physics. Capitalism is not an innate part of human nature. It's just a social institution. I admit it's a really large social institution. It's really huge and it's hard to imagine how we're ever going to abolish it. But folks, it's just a social institution. It was created by human beings. It has a specific history. If it's something we made, it is something we can unmake. Plain and simple. Not easy to do, but doable. That's the good news. The bad news is capitalism didn't get here all by itself. It got here in part because of its extraordinary flexibility. That's one of the really hard things about capitalism. It seems like it's a really rigid system, but it's not. It's a really adaptable system. Damn it, that's part of the problem. It's really good at figuring out a way to fit itself into different sets of social conditions. Also, capitalism has figured out how to make weird temporary alliances with other social systems of hierarchy and domination. Now, that history is really complicated and really messy. It's not simple and straightforward. But if you look at the way that history has interacted in complicated ways with patriarchy, with colonialism, with the history of racism and white supremacy, with the history of the rise of the nation state, all of those things and others, that's the bad news. If we want to dismantle capitalism, we don't just have to dismantle capitalism. We got a lot of other dismantling to do along the way. Part of the point of social ecology is that we don't just offer a rejection of capitalism. We do that, but we try to offer a comprehensive alternative based on attempting to overcome the full spectrum of domination and hierarchy. All the different social institutions that have distorted social relations and devastated the natural world. And I'm sorry to say that's asking a lot of any movement. That's no small order. That's a really major, large demand. So we're not just fighting capitalism, we're fighting capitalism and its allies, its complicated and messy allies. Even if we look just at North America, we shouldn't. We should look at this in a global perspective. But even if in fact, I'll make that even smaller. Even if we look just at the United States, we're here in the United States. I know we're almost in Canada. We're here in the United States. You cannot make sense of the history of capitalism without also understanding the history of colonialism, the history of racialized exploitation of both people and landscapes, the destruction and dispossession of indigenous communities, the transatlantic slave trade. All of those things are integral parts of the history of capitalism just in this one country. There is no way we can hope to understand the emergence of capitalism without taking all of those other complex dynamics into account. That makes our job harder. That makes things messy. I want to note right now, one in particular, the relationship between capitalism and the state. That's a really controversial topic on the left. I come from the anarchist tradition, so you can guess what I'm going to say, or maybe you can't guess what I'm going to say. I actually think this one is complex. The way I would put it is this: the logic of the state, especially the logic of the modern nation state, what it basically does is it tends to absorb efforts at reform. For what it's worth, I'm not flatly opposed to reform. No sane environmental activist and climate activist is totally opposed to reform. That would be silly. You have to be strategic and thoughtful about it. But what the state does is it tends to absorb and then neutralize efforts at reform when it doesn't simply deflect them away. And that's a problem. If you're thinking in climate crisis terms, what are we asking state actors to do? What are we demanding of state actors? Or for that matter, what are we asking corporate actors to do? What are we demanding of them? Social ecologists tend to focus more on grassroots action, power from the ground up, but that doesn't really solve the underlying conundrum. It just sort of displaces it one level. When we talk about capitalism and the climate crisis, the usual answer to that is, and the answer is not wrong, but the usual answer is basically to say capitalism takes power away from workers, most of us, and gives power to a small stratum of owners, investors, executives, managers, what have you. That's absolutely true. I'm not denying that. But what I want to ask all of you to consider for a moment, and this is hard, this is challenging. This gets us back to a question that came up in Brian's presentation that in turn led to a question. Was it Katie who asked the question? Somebody asked it, I forget who. It was a great presentation and brought up all these interesting questions, but it led to an interesting sort of back and forth. What I want us to consider is the ways in which capitalism, when you think about it, weirdly disempowers absolutely everybody, including the people I don't want to use a bad word for, the really yucky, scary people that we all hate and despise, who have way too much power. Even they are paradoxically disempowered by capitalism. The way you can get a sense of that is think about the periods of crisis that capitalism repeatedly produces, where even extremely powerful, extremely wealthy, extremely prominent people cannot fix the problem. Look at the financial crisis of 2008. Think about the very famous companies that went totally bankrupt during that time. Think about the very rich people who lost everything during that period. Look at the inflation crisis right now. A president struggling to get inflation under control. Companies trying to either make a bigger buck off of inflation or trying to get things under central bankers trying to, very powerful people trying and utterly failing to solve what shouldn't be a particularly hard problem. It's like a math problem, for God's sake. They can't solve it. And then think of the really hard ones. Think of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Just a catastrophic failure of capitalism where, it drove all sorts of formerly very rich and very powerful people completely out of business. Some of them ended their lives because of it. There are any number of historical examples of this. Really powerful, really wealthy people who are totally powerless to affect the course of capitalism when they really want to, when it means something to them, when their own livelihoods and their own power is on the line, and they can't. If you think about it from that point of view, I'm not asking you in any way to feel their pain, to feel any pity or remorse for them. I'm just asking you to think about it from a structural point of view for a second. When you think about it that way, capitalism sometimes looks like a runaway train that nobody is driving. Now, most of us are in the middle or the back of that train. We're not up in the front. We're not up in the locomotive or the steam engine or what's at the front of a train? Whatever they call the thing at the front of the train, we're not up there. But guess what? The people who are up there, they have no clue what they're doing. They can't steer the damn thing. They keep trying to pull the brakes and the brakes aren't working. That's a serious problem. I want us to think about what that means for our understanding of capitalism. One possible implication of that is, what if capitalism is a system that wasn't designed by anybody for any particular person's or group's or whatever's benefit? What if it's just a really fucked up system that keeps doing its own thing regardless of whoever thinks they're in control for a few years? I'm not even necessarily advocating that as my actual current position, but it's a real possibility that we need to give some serious thought to. Okay, I want to get close to wrapping up, and Mason, I have totally lost track of time.
It's 2:53.
So I should do like 5 more minutes? Okay, I will try to do 5 more minutes. Here's what this makes me think. Sometimes capitalism works the way it's supposed to work, and that really sucks because we don't want capitalism to work the way it's supposed to work. But sometimes it just kind of stops working for a while. And no one, the world's most brilliant economists can't figure out why it's doing what it's doing, but it keeps doing what it's doing. Here's the thing, when capitalism fails, it doesn't fail equally. And when it's weird little partner / rival, the state, when the state fails, it doesn't fail the same for everybody. So when Brian said last night, climate justice is going to be absolutely essential to any successful climate movement, that is the truth. If we are taking capitalism seriously, it's not enough to just say we're opposed to capitalism. We have to be mindful of the ways that the failures of capitalism come down on different people's heads really, really differently. They hit different communities in different ways. It's crucial for us to keep that in mind. Okay, let me skip forward. I want to give us a lot of time to do our small groups. My last little bit. Some of you have heard me say this before in different contexts. We are not the only capitalists. We're not capitalists. We are not the only anti-capitalists out there. I know a bunch of you are already involved in confronting the far right, so much so that we are, where is Graham? We are going to do a series of evening sessions about that in the days to come. It's a very important question. That's not what I'm talking about right now. But I'm going to talk a little bit about right now because it fits so perfectly into any discussion of capitalism. Anybody who has worked on confronting the far right knows there's a hell of a lot of people on the radical right who also oppose capitalism. If that's news to you, if that sounds really weird to you, come talk to Graham, come talk to me, come talk to anybody who's involved in that kind of work, because it is true. A lot of people on the radical right, they hate capitalism too. And they're not just saying it, they mean it. They mean it 1,000%. They genuinely hate capitalism. Now, their reasons might be different. And I have to say, sometimes their reasons are actually not entirely so different as we might want to think. And also the political implications are effectively the opposite. But nobody here should fall for the notion that mere opposition to capitalism is all by itself emancipatory. It does not have to be. It can just as easily be reactionary. I want us to understand that. It goes back to what I was saying before about the ways that capitalism is implicated in things like colonialism and racial hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really a crucially important point. There are other possibilities out there in the real world besides capitalism that will not be more democratic, that will not be more egalitarian. They could actually be more authoritarian. They could potentially be even more ecologically disastrous than the current system. Now, I don't mention the far right by accident. I mention it because it's on everybody's minds right now. Since we are here in the US, a question for all of us: what if Trump wins in November? Is that gonna, I just want us to put that question out there because we got to face that possibility, distinct possibility right now. Is that going to change something fundamental about the nature of capitalism? I grant you, it's going to change a lot about the parameters of the climate struggle. It'll do that for sure. But would it actually change anything significant about the underlying economic and social logic that drives the current ecological crisis? And on that question, I'm with you. I'm shaking my head on that one. I'm really not so sure that it would change something at that fundamental level, although I am open to, I'd love to hear somebody challenge me on that one in the small group discussion. What that would change if it happens. Nobody here wants that to happen. If Trump did win, what that would change is the tenor of political life in this country. Indeed, it would change the tenor of civil society in this country. Repression would skyrocket. Racism would intensify. Authoritarianism would go through the roof. We need to recognize that. But if we're talking about opportunities to challenge capitalism, I also want us to recognize this. If that were to happen, it would also mean an increase in resistance. And it would actually mean a chance for expanding the space for resistance. Trump is a an embodiment in a weird way of the authoritarian right. It's strange that he ended up being that embodiment, but for whatever reason, he's the embodiment of the authoritarian right. If the authoritarian right comes to power again in this country, it gives us an opportunity to renew the best traditions of the anti-authoritarian left. Traditions that the Institute for Social Ecology grew out of. That's a very rich set of traditions on the anti-authoritarian left. That's a real opportunity. That is a chance for people to stand up and say, we have been opposed to the damage and destruction that capitalism inflicts on everybody's lives. We've been saying that all along, and we have a radically different vision of social life to offer. And we don't just have a vision of social life, we have a whole different set of practices that go along with it. We can show folks, this is what direct democracy looks like in practice. This is how people can actually do it. This is how to put it into action. You can show that to a much broader swath of people. Because if that's what happens in November, and again, I hope it does not happen. If that happens in November, what I think you're going to find is that a much broader section of people who were not previously looking around for radical alternatives, they are going to be looking for radical alternatives because of the gaping hole at the center in this country. That's going to be an empty space in our political life for a while, and because of simple revulsion at the direction this country has once again taken. A much larger number of people, I anticipate, are going to be, for a while, open to more radical perspectives. And in my experience, people respond to principled stances. People respond to groups that can say, we have been doing this for a while. We didn't just come up with this set of ideas because some asshole won some election and we figured, here's our chance, we can pounce. But we can point to work that we have been doing, in some cases for decades, and say, this is a genuine alternative that points to a different future, a future that is beyond capitalism, not in a scary right-wing authoritarian, exclusivist, isolationist, anti-immigrant direction, but in an inclusive and liberatory and directly democratic, freedom-oriented direction. I think a lot of people will say, at this point, I would like to hear more about that. Thank you so much for your participation. Let's try to withdraw away from the beating sun and move into small groups. Is that cool? Is that the right move? Okay, thank you, everybody.